This is Things Police See, First-Hand Accounts, with your host, Steve Gould.
Hey guys, welcome to the podcast that interviews active and retired police officers about their most intense, bizarre, and sometimes humorous moments on the job. I'm your host, Steve Gould. Thank you for joining us. Good to have you here. This is episode number 74, if you can believe it. 74 episodes. I'm very proud of this podcast. If you go back at the catalog, after this, there'll be 74 hours of great content, and I have zero credit for any of it. These are just guys and gals in law enforcement who come on and they tell their stories, and they are freaking incredible. I'm just so happy that this catalog of interviews is there. It's kind of an evergreen thing. I can take a break and come back, and people still download them. I'm just so grateful that that law enforcement officers want to share this, and I think it's important, especially now, for people to hear what this job is really like. Really put yourself in their shoes. So I get a lot of emails about people who love the show, and I'm so grateful for that. And a lot of them are not law enforcement; they're just people who stumbled upon it, and they just grow to really appreciate police from hearing these officers' stories, and I couldn't be happier to be involved in it. Our guest today is fantastic. He's been on 2 times before. He's very popular, and for good reason. He's done a ton in his career. It's Gary Steiner. He was on episode... I have notes for this. He was on episode 56, FBI corruption pertaining to Whitey Bulger sightings. That was a very popular episode, very fun and crazy to hear his account of it. And then he was on episode 54, where he talked about just his long career at Santa Monica Police Department, being patrol detective, sergeant. Great and crazy stories from that. So I'm really, really excited to have him today. I feel like I'm extra. If you see the video, I'm extra pink. There's no way to fix it, guys. I have orange hair, and in New England, it's over 50 degrees now, so I'm getting burnt already. I can't stop. And let me defend myself a little bit. I feel like my intros lately have been kind of clunky, and it's because of the video that I'm doing is so helpful for even just the audio, because we can see each other's faces. But it's like a lot of pressure, because I'm looking right now at Gary, like in the green room, and he's like off to the corner there. So there's no like redos. I have to do this intro, and sometimes the pressure makes me stumble. But he hasn't shook his head or laughed too hard, so I think I'm okay. I apologize. Makeup didn't get to me in time. Makeup and hair. I do have. If you're a redhead, you know that you will have acne from the age of 10 until you are dead. So that's what's going on there. The nice thing is, when I went to the dermatologist, just a side note, once you hit like 30, it's not acne anymore. It's rosacea. It's supposed to make you feel better, I guess. Like, oh, don't worry about that's rosacea. So I feel a little bit better about that. But, I don't do much editing. So you're going to have to stare at it. But without further ado, I want to bring Gary on, because today's episode is going to be super interesting. Gary is a subject matter expert, a confessional evidence expert. He can correct me on that, for interview and interrogation. So he can actually testify in court about this stuff. He's going to tell us all about it. By the time Gary's done, you'll be able to walk into your boss's office and have a conversation. He or she will be crying and giving you any time that you need or overtime. That's what Gary promises with this. Gary's going to teach me to talk to my chief in such a way that I'm chief, and he is now patrolman. So I'm excited to have him on. Without further ado, let me bring on the great Gary Steiner. Gary, welcome to the show.
Oh my gosh, Steve, an intro like that, how am I supposed to respond? All I can say is I wish you didn't have this electronically recorded, because when that happens, it's like there's no redos. It's going to be there.
It's it
forever. And
yes,
that's why you've got so many states that are saying if cops are going to do an interview and interrogation from start to finish, it should be electronically recorded. This is all there for people to see, which is, I think, ultimately, it's as good for us as body cams and car cams before that.
Isn't it funny how the body cam issue came up, and all police officers, including myself, kind of recoiled. We're like, it's because it's like a lot of them forward record, like 30 seconds. So they say they don't do audio, but it's kind of creepy to have someone recording everything you do, and it makes you like kind of second guess yourself all the time. That being said, a lot of huge departments went forward with it. My department's in the process of doing it. And geez, it's just silence about it, isn't it? Isn't it funny how all these videos do nothing but vindicate police, and no one, the media and our critics could care less about body cams now?
I remember when I was a patrol cop, and this is probably mid to late 70s, and the micro cassette recorders first came out, and everybody was buying them. Everybody. Long before agencies decided that this is something that should be issued to people, cops are buying them because they were memorializing what cops had testified to on the stand. And it wasn't just your word against an offender or a complainant.
Sure.
You had some kind of verification there. And that hugely improved your credibility.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, they don't want to hear it.
but it's good for us.
Absolutely.
It's good for us.
Absolutely.
And who was at the forefront of getting those things out in the field? It was individual cops using their own money.
Yeah.
It wasn't the departments spending the money on it. It was individual cops doing it.
So interesting. Gary, we're talking today about interview and interrogation. We're doing an interview right now. How would you define the difference between me interviewing you and me interrogating you?
Well, although interviews can turn into interrogations, the basic difference is this. An interview is a means of gathering information that isn't confrontational, and it's not accusatory. So you might hint at some things, you might make some suggestions to the person that you're interviewing, but you're not going to get in that person's face and accuse him of committing an act directly. Whereas an interrogation, you're going to be confrontational at some point, and you're going to be accusatory because you believe this person's responsible for something that you're investigating, either an accident or a criminal act. And people that have things to hide are usually going to end up in an interrogation if it's something law enforcement related. People that are witnesses, people that are victims. Sometimes those people are initially looked at as being suspects, and it comes out a little later that they didn't commit any wrongdoing. They were wrongly accused, not through any malfeasance on the part of the officer, investigator. And you may start out with an interrogation, and part of our job, or part of my job as a detective, as a police officer, as a police supervisor, sometimes questioning people that worked under my authority, you've got to put somebody on the spot and make a determination whether or not they're guilty of some kind of malfeasance. And if they aren't, it's also your responsibility to exonerate them as soon as possible.
Right. Absolutely. So what makes you an expert on like confessional evidence? How do you get that designation?
Well, there isn't a real high bar for experts, as you know. It just means more knowledge than the average person. But in my case, I've got a pretty heavy background in terms of formal training in interview and interrogation, as well as experiential training to back it up. When I left California about 3 years ago, there were 4 experts on the panel of approved experts that is established by the County of Los Angeles Criminal Court, the Superior Courts. And I was the 5th. I believe I was the 5th. The other 4 had PhD, JD, initials after their last names.
Fancy acronym. or whatever.
Yeah,
Abbreviations.
fancy acronym for academia. And in fact, none of those people had ever conducted a interrogation as a police officer with the responsibility to make a determination as to criminal culpability.
Isn't that
None
something?
of those people, to my knowledge, had interviewed victims before or
Wow.
witnesses before. And I had at least 5,000 interrogations that just very basically I could bring out as a part of my practical background, in addition to hundreds of hours of training from some of the best known and best respected law enforcement interview and interrogation schools that are out there, including John Reed and Associates, Behavioral Analysis Training Institute, Interview and Interrogation Institute. The last two are California organizations that are post-recognized, post-approved, and training that I'd received from LAPD, the FBI, and other law enforcement agencies while I was on the job.
Interesting. So let me bounce this off you. Of course, I took the basic interview and interrogation class in academy, and it's all very exciting when you're new and you're like, I'm going to apply these fundamentals, and then you eventually you hit patrol and it's you forget half the stuff you were supposed to be doing with it. You kind of need to brush up. But when I for a brief period, for about 2 years, I did insurance investigations, and the insurance companies are required for their SIU units to do a certain amount of in-service training, just like police, because you have to have those training hours to keep the unit up to speed. So we took like a very basic interview and interrogation class, but it was interesting. Like, even the guy who taught it was a very experienced police officer who's retired, now working as a consultant kind of for insurance. And he explained, like, it doesn't have to be so complicated. Like, he said the basic technique he was going over was rudimentary. It was just building, he described it like building boxes when you talk with someone. So he said, like, you get a place, a time, a person they were with, you get them to marry themselves to that. And then as you go, you build little boxes. And then if you keep interviewing them down the way, an hour later, they might start contradicting those boxes, and then you go back to them. And I thought that was kind of an interesting way to describe it. Like, you're kind of hemming people in to one version and then getting them to contradict that. I mean, I could see problems with that theory, but it was kind of like a very basic way to describe it. And since I have you on the line and you're an expert, what do you think of this guy?
I didn't attend his class.
Right.
So I'm not going to take any shots at him. But I can tell you that when we're talking about rudimentary, attending the LA County Sheriff's Academy back in the 70s, twice, once as a reserve officer, and then after I was hired as a full-time police officer, we had what I think nationally would be recognized as outstanding training.
Mm-hmm.
That said, our interview and interrogation training was limited to some very, very basics. Starting with, this is how you stand when you interview someone for a field interview card. You want to blade yourself with your gun away from the subject.
Yeah, they still do that.
They're not going to kick you in the nuts.
Yep.
Now, that is useful information, but it's not necessarily going to get you information that's going to show whether or not the person you're talking to is the offender that you're looking for.
Mm.
And although we talked about Miranda and what kind of things are necessary to establish a situation where you're going to have to admonish someone regarding their constitutional rights, that was it. And a lot of what we learned was in the field through FTO, and a lot of things the FTO told us was good in terms of you don't want to give someone too much information. You want to hold back. But a lot of what they gave you was less than best practices as we recognize them now. A lot less than best practices as we recognize them now.
I noticed that,
And
like, just doing a bunch of interviews for insurance, just letting people talk, like getting used to not being comfortable with silence and seeing how they'll keep talking. That was the best thing I ever learned, was just being quiet, because they'll keep talking. They'll ramble and ramble. They'll
well,
keep
sometimes they will, but when you're dealing with someone that's charged with a very serious crime, or you're dealing with someone that's had a lot of interactions with law enforcement, and I can just tell you from personal experience in talking to other investigators, um, talking to people that work patrol when I was in detectives, is that most cops, when they get uh, formal interview and interrogation training using behavioral analysis based techniques, they don't put that training to use, and it's a perishable skill. And
mm,
unfortunately, far too often, you have police officers that just learn this stuff on the street in terms of, well, I'm going to let them talk, or I'm going to get in their face, or I'm going to shout here, or do this.
right,
And it might work with some people, but it isn't consistently reliable.
right,
And a lot of times, its unreliability rears its head, and you get, if not false confessions, then confessions or admissions that aren't reliable. And that's the most important thing that an investigator can do, is understand that getting reliable admissions so you can understand what happened regarding not just the person you're talking to, but the event itself, is hugely important. And in order to do that, you need to develop these skills, and you need to practice them. You need to refine your ability to use them. And there are a lot of very specific techniques and tactics that you put to use if you have the training. And a lot of it requires some creativity on the person that's doing the interviews. But I don't believe it's something that people just naturally have. I think it's a learned skill. And I think it's very important to get that formal training and to put it to use repeatedly.
absolutely. Yeah, when I was at a LAPD backgrounds and being field trained there, I had my trainer was did a career as a captain in Covina, and he did drug task force and detectives and all that stuff. And he was such, like, I thought I was okay until this guy started training me, and watching him interview a candidate, I was like, how is he getting down? How is he? People would end up crying. These candidates would, like, just start talking about their dad's abusive past or their problem with crystal meth, or he just got it out of them. And I think it's because he just, number one, he's very sharp, but he did a lot of it. He did a lot of interviews, and he was just so good at it. I always, even when I got off training and he gave me his blessing and I was doing my thing, times when he wanted someone to sit in on an interview, or wanted, someone present for a dicey one or something, I just was like, damn, this guy is good. And I think it's just sheer, number one, he was good at it. He had a talent for it, but he did a lot of them. And it just came
Practice,
so naturally.
practice.
Yeah, totally.
It's so important. And what used to be a pet peeve of mine was when uh, I was working patrol and I was a relatively new officer, and I heard cops around me say, all that stuff, that interview and interrogation stuff, are things that I'll learn if I ever get a detective assignment. And then they'll send me to the schools and I'll learn this stuff. And the fact is that you develop and hone your investigative skills, including interviews and interrogations, in patrol. If you're not doing that, and for me, it took 8 years for me to leave the patrol environment to go to a strictly investigative position. If you're not doing that in the early part of your career, then chances are you're not going to accept the new training that contradicts a lot of the stuff you learned on the street from your buddies, from your coworkers,
Right.
when it is offered to you. And that's why, in my opinion, I think we see maybe 10% of the investigators that are working on police departments actually putting to use the formal training that they've learned, and it becomes very problematic. I saw it when I was a patrol officer, I saw it when I was a detective, when I was a supervisor, and then after I retired for over 10 years, I was an investigative and an expert resource for indigent criminal defendants, and I saw it way too many times in that role. And it's very problematic. And if I can give you like one of my earliest experiences, I think you kind of see where I'm coming from, because my FTO, figuratively, not literally, pounded this point into my brain when I made a traffic stop one night with him very early in my probation. We were working a marked unit, and we see a woman driving a car who did a quote California stop, where she kind of rolled through a stop sign without coming to a complete stop. Activated the red lights. She pulled over. Nice middle-aged lady. Didn't seem to me to be anyone I needed to worry about in terms of either officer safety issues or um, being any kind of a criminal, not credible. But when I asked her for a driver's license, registration, proof of insurance, she told me, well, I've got my registration and I got my insurance card in the glove compartment, but I don't have my license with me. And I made a determination. Lady sounded legit. So I asked her for her full name, and she gave me her name, and I wrote it down. And my partner started giving me what I think it's referred to formally as the stink eye treatment. And I looked at him, and I looked back at her, couldn't quite figure out what was going on in his mind. I asked her for her address and her date of birth, and she provided that information, and I wrote them down. And I turned to look at my partner again, and he's getting a little bit more intense looking at me. I couldn't quite figure out what was happening there, but I got the rest of her information, and I wrote out the citation, and I handed her a pen and the cite book and asked her to sign her name on the dotted line. And he was looking a little unhappy with my performance, but he didn't say what it was until after she'd signed the cite, and I gave her her copy, and she drove off. And he said, how do you know anything that she told you was true? And I told him, I said, well, she gave me a name that was the same name on the registration card. She seemed honest. She didn't seem like a crook. He said, well, anybody could take a registration card out of a glove box, look at it, memorize the name, right? Do you know if she even had a driver's license? And I said, no, I didn't. And he said, well, let me ask you something. Suppose that woman had been arrested 3 times for DUI, and the last time was a fatal DUI-related traffic collision, and they took away her driver's license. You had see any issues with that? I said, well, yeah, I mean, you've got probably hundreds of hours of investigative time that cops dealt with her leading up to that conviction.
Now you're crapping your pants. You're like, uh-oh.
Well, yeah. Hundreds of investigative hours wasted. The woman may have spent days in court. She may have gone to jail. The court may have pulled her driver's license or driving privilege away from her, ordered her not to drive. And here you are making everything that was done by those other cops, by the prosecutors, by the courts, null and void.
Oh, my gosh.
But it gets better. He says, what if the name she gave you wasn't her own? Suppose she gave you the name and date of birth of an acquaintance of hers, a family member that hadn't committed a crime. You think she's going to show up in 30 days to court? No, I don't think so. Well, what do you think's going to happen with that citation?
The warrant. Oh,
It's going to
man.
go to warrant. What do you think's going to happen if the real person with that name and date of birth gets pulled over by a cop like yourself who runs this person for warrants? And it comes back with a valid warrant for arrest, and it's a Friday.
Oh, man, they're going to be
She's
held
going to
over
end
the
up spending the
weekend.
weekend in jail, right?
This is a good trainer.
And well, he's given me terrific lessons, but the best and worst of it all was that he let me go through all this before he brings this stuff up. So now I'm thinking, as she's driven down the street, I mean, there goes my career. What am I doing to the organization? And he says, beyond that, he says, suppose this lady that was convicted for all these crimes gave you the false name because she's wanted for something even more serious now, and she's driven off. So
You're like, here's my badge, here's my gun. I quit.
Yeah. When I got back to the station, as a learning point, I ran this woman's information. She ended up having told me the truth, but it was a good lesson learned.
Sure.
And a day or two later, working with the same FTO, I pulled a guy over who lost his driver's license. Only this time, I used the techniques and the tactics that he instructed me to use in cases like this. And the first thing I did was I gave him an FI card and my pen. And I had him flip that card over where the narrative section is. And I said, hey, look, I need to verify who you are. And I don't want to make any mistakes. So I want you to print on the back of this piece of paper your full first, middle, and last name and your date of birth. And of course the guy does. And I said, your social security number. And he said he did, but now he's getting a little tense about it. I said, well, write that on the bottom too. And then after I retrieved that information, then I did a check with dispatch for driver's license verification. Guess what? Nobody in California had a name and date of birth that he provided, nor the address that he said he lived at. And later I was to learn that that was a valid social security number, but it was somebody else's name. But the important part was that while I attempted to verify his credibility, and verification is huge in interview and interrogation, it gave me the ability to make a lawful arrest per the vehicle code for this person being an unlicensed driver, providing false information to a peace officer. And what does that open up? It opens up the car for a search incidental to the arrest.
Sure.
What do you think I found in the glove compartment? A fistful of citations written to people who matched his description with different names and different date of births.
Wow.
And underneath the driver's seat, I found a wallet, and it had his true ID, but it wasn't a driver's license. It was a parolee ID card. And he turned out to be wanted. I think it was for burglary, among other things. But you might think, well, yeah, it's a good arrest. But I think more than anything else, it demonstrates good techniques and tactics that my FTO emphasized.
Absolutely.
And I became a believer. As he said later, a monster was born at that point because I used that technique and developed on it throughout my career. And it was hugely important. Working patrol would average 3 arrests for false information to a peace officer, California Vehicle Code violation, per week.
Oh my goodness.
If they provided a true name of someone else under the penal code, there's a felony section for charging someone that uses the name of another that could cause adverse circumstances in the justice system. So if I use your name and I'm released out on a written promise to appear, even if I use your name and I'm booked under that name and I bail out, and you get arrested, or there's a potential that you could get arrested for that false information, I've committed a felony. And it's a good felony arrest.
Yeah, hell yeah.
But as good as it is in terms of giving a cop the ability to make the arrest, it also does something else, and that's it prevents a wrongful arrest of someone else, some innocent third party, because I don't think
That's
there's
the
any
worst
cops out
part,
there that
Gary.
want to victimize people.
That's a great point, and that's terrible. That's awful. To arrest some person that like is looking at you doe-eyed, like, what the hell's going on? That is terrible.
If you remember this, and it's been a few years since I've been retired, but back in the day, when we stopped people out in the field on a traffic violation, or we arrested someone for a citable offense and they didn't have ID, it was a common practice in my agency and many others, including LAPD, for an officer to have an ink pad in the car. And he'd take the suspect and he'd put the suspect's thumbprint on the pink copy, the officer's copy of the citation.
Really?
So that somewhere down the line, if the guy got arrested,
Yeah.
and he said, "Oh, well, that wasn't me that was released on this written promise to appear," you could have a comparison done between the thumbprint on the officer's copy and his own thumbprint.
Wow, I've never heard of that.
Oh yeah, that was a big thing, at least with my agency. But the bad part about that is, if this isn't the person that was cited and released, yeah, you're getting them exonerated ultimately, but what if they spent the weekend in jail? I mean, what if they only spent what if they spent only a couple hours in jail? You know, what are they going to be feeling when that exoneration comes after going through all that?
That's traumatic. That's traumatic, Gary. Like you're witnessing a lot of good folks' worst day of their life, if in a lot of arrests for OUI, stuff like that, where they've never been arrested. Like it is devastating to like a otherwise upright and good citizen to be arrested. It really is. Like it destroys them mentally, and I've seen it in the booking room. Like these aren't bad guys; they're just someone who had a bad day and they end up getting arrested. It is earth-shattering, and to do that to someone who didn't even deserve it. Oh man. That sucks.
And you can be totally legally justified in doing this.
Sure.
It doesn't mean you're not acting in good faith.
Of course.
But I think that we have to take those extra steps, not just to ensure that the person we have is the offender, but to exonerate innocent persons and prevent innocent persons from suffering consequences of things they had no power to control.
Of course. Gary, you're going to hate this. I just got an email before we came on here. From an officer that I had on the podcast before from Virginia, and effective immediately in her county, they can no longer do a motor vehicle stop for headlight violation, taillight violation, blinkers, expired registration, unless it's more than 4 months. So you're talking about motor vehicle stops where so much more is discovered. And it's well known in the law enforcement community that motor vehicle stops lead to so much more. They effectively have taken, the state of Virginia has taken these officers and removed this huge component of being able to enforce the law. They can't, she said it's like they're being scrutinized too. It's like they made this new law and it's like they're watching it. Like you cannot make these stops anymore.
That's insane. That's absolutely insane. And it isn't just wrong because it's preventing you from making a good arrest. It's wrong because it's giving a green light to offenders, almost literally, not to worry about traveling from crime scene to safety. That there aren't any consequences for committing wrongful acts.
Yeah,
And
these are all now
it's
secondary
only going to make
offenses.
things worse. And the thing is, the people that push for this kind of legislation and enact this kind of legislation, they have absolutely zero law enforcement experience whatsoever. They have zero knowledge
Right.
of the consequences of their acts. It's a knee-jerk reaction that is far more destructive than it does towards solving any problems.
Yeah, and we know Virginia is like a bedroom community for DC, so that's just the way that state is. I was shocked to learn that. I always thought like Virginia, that's the South, like they're pretty conservative. No, Virginia is not. It's dominated by the folks in DC, and their governor is completely out of his mind. So I just was hard. She told me that, and I was like, damn, that really takes a wind out of your sails.
I've got an East Coast story regarding a pedestrian stop for jaywalking that you might like to hear. So I went all in on verifying people's identities before I released someone on a written promise to appear. And as I said, I'd get 3, maybe 4 arrests per week for people that had lied to me about who they were, because usually they were wanted for more serious offenses.
Of course.
And when I mean more serious, yeah, a lot of those were just warrants for traffic violations, and they were stopped for another traffic violation. But some of those other crimes they were wanted for were far more serious crimes, including armed robbery, including an assault with a deadly weapon on a police officer. I believe that was a St. Louis case. And while doing this, I took the lessons that I'd learned in FTO and I built up upon them. And one of the things that I did was created the bail deviation officer ruse. And what I knew was...
Can you tell everybody what a ruse is?
A ruse is a lie that is legally employed by a police officer during the course and scope of his employment.
The funnest thing you will do in interrogation.
It's
It's the best thing to do.
And honestly, I've kind of gone away from recommending an outright lie, and now I suggest that instead you provide the what if scenario, or is there any reason that scenario, and it makes it a little bit more palatable.
Right.
But the difference would be telling a suspect, hey, we have your fingerprints at the crime scene.
Yes.
Which, if the suspect was wearing gloves, that's going to be counterproductive to your ability to get information from them.
Right. I've used that exact thing before, Gary, when I said, because a lot of people, members of the public, believe we have like an idea machine that you drop a piece of cellophane in and it's like bloop, 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 and it gives like their social security number. So I'd used those ruse like that before, where I was just like, oh yeah, the county already has it. It's already got, we've already got our suspects named, and it worked. In my case, it worked. I did it a couple times on patrol, and it did work. But it could very easily, like you said, backfire and get nowhere and make you look like a fool.
I've discarded that for the "is there any reason why" question. So instead of saying we got your fingerprints at the scene, I might ask a suspect, "Is there any reason why we'd find your fingerprints or your DNA on anything associated with this crime?"
Just as good.
And let them think about it. But you're not outright lying to them, so
Right.
They can't say, "I've got you." You're asking them a question.
Because a lot of people say that's entrapment, but those people don't understand what entrapment is.
Exactly. And unfortunately, those people are the ones that enact this kind of legislation. They don't understand what the law is because they were just elected to office. They may not be lawyers, and they're just, again, it's a knee-jerk reaction to a perceived issue. In this case, it's probably regarding, unlawful or excessive uses of force, rather than understanding what the laws are pertaining to traffic stops and what becomes of traffic stops. So the bail deviation officer ruse that I used was in California, if you were stopped for an infraction or a misdemeanor, and the law provided that you could be released on a written promise to appear, there was the caveat that the officer had to be able to reasonably believe you were identified before issuing that citation. And if the officer couldn't articulate why he or she believed that you'd provided true information regarding your identity, then you could be physically arrested, brought back to the police station for purposes of booking, and you might even have to post bail. Now, for some violations, like for instance jaywalking, that bail amount might only be $25, $50, $100, very minimal amount.
Sure.
For other things, it could be a greater amount. But in any case, we had 3 hours to investigate an incident that gave us probable cause to arrest before we had to decide that this person's going to be booked and told what their bail is and given the opportunity to make their phone calls and arrange bail, arrange for a lawyer, whatever, or released. So the bail deviation officer ruse was I would stop someone who might tell me that they didn't have a driver's license in the state. Maybe they'd say they never had a driver's license or an ID card, and that they didn't have any means for me to verify the information that they provided. And my response would be, wow, I'm so sorry to hear that. Because if I can't verify who you are, I'm going to have to arrest you on this offense. And there's a good possibility, because everybody has driver's licenses, everybody has an ID card, or lacking those, they have somebody that I could contact to verify their identity. They're lying to me. I may have to go to our bail deviation office and request a deviation on your bail until such time that your prints can be verified by the FBI. And the way things now stand, that can take 6 to 8 weeks. So you'd be stuck. You'll only stay in our jail for 2 or 3 days, and then you'll have to go to the county. And you could be stuck there for 6 to 8 weeks until your identification is verified. And when it is, if you were wanted for something more serious, this doesn't count towards your good time off. All that starts after you've been ID'd. So I don't want to see you spend all this time in jail for nothing. So if you help me verify who you really are, I can give you a citation. If you got a warrant for your arrest, hey, we deal with that. You go to court the next court date, you'll probably get time served. If it's something more serious, well, that's going to come out in the wash anyhow, because if the judge approves this request, you're not getting out of jail.
I mean, it's too bad you're going to have to go to Pound Me in the Butt County Prison, but
yeah. Well, in most of the situations that I presented that ruse, because quite frankly, I'm not going to write up a bail deviation, wake a judge up, in the middle of the night,
sure,
to have, jack the bail up to $1 million on a $25 jaywalking violation. In most of the situations, I'm going to get a cop out from someone.
Yes.
Or they're going to want to talk to me and provide me with information that I can use to verify their identity with, which could be a phone number and a name of someone. And that's a real easy thing to do, because even back in the late 1970s and early 80s, when I was still a young cop, we did have the telephone. And I could use it, even a payphone out in the field, to verify who someone was by calling a family member, a friend, someone. So it was a really effective technique. I trained other officers in this during roll call training, and I became quite proficient at it. One night, I'm working one officer, patrol, as most of our units were one officer, unless we were in an FTO situation. I saw a guy crossing the street against a "Don't Walk" sign, and I stopped him. He appeared to be homeless. He had a backpack with him. He was unwashed. Uh, I told him why I had stopped him, and he told me that he didn't have any ID with him, but that he once had a California driver's license or a California ID card. I had him write this information on a field interview card for me in his own hand. And when I attempted to verify it with dispatch, I was told no one with a California driver's license or ID card um, with that name and that date of birth had ever received the official document. So with that, I told him that I was going to arrest him for the violation, and I did. And what this did next was it enabled me to do the search incidental to the arrest, or was is often known in other law enforcement agencies and ours too, an accelerated pre-booking search of his person and his personal property. So I went into his backpack after finding that he didn't even have a wallet on him. And in the backpack, I found among dirty clothes that indicated he'd been living on the street, a hardcore porn magazine,
Naturally.
which, when I picked it up, felt a little heavier than usual, and it contained a large butcher knife,
Ooh.
which I thought was a little unusual. And in addition to the butcher knife, there was a clipping from a newspaper of an article talking about the association between hardcore porn and violent crimes against women.
Ooh.
Now, that kind of got the spidey senses going.
Yeah.
And I told him that I was going to go a lot further than just taking him to jail. I used the bail deviation ruse. And he swore up and down that he'd had ID, but it wasn't in California. Now he said that he'd had ID issued from the state of Massachusetts.
How dare he?
Come from a town called Quincy.
Quincy!
Which up until then I'd never heard of before.
Yeah, John Quincy Adams.
Yeah, well, he was a visitor to the state of California. He'd just come out to enjoy the nicer weather. And he informed me that he did have ID from Massachusetts, but wouldn't you know it, he'd left his bags with that information in a bus locker at the Greyhound terminal in Santa Monica. And if only he could get into that bus locker, he could show me who he was and I could release him on a site. Well, this is like midnight on Saturday. And unfortunately, that Greyhound terminal isn't 24/7. So when I brought him back to the police station and he told me that he would grant me consent to go into that locker, I didn't have any way of getting in there. But what I did do was I contacted, no, I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. I talked to our dispatch center, and like many police agencies, we have emergency cards on file for businesses that are located within our city limits.
Sure.
And I found that the manager of the Greyhound terminal in Santa Monica lived in the city. So I gave her a call. I explained the situation. I told her I was concerned that this guy may be wanted for something else and that he'd given me a bogus name. But I wanted to follow up on his claims that he had ID. And she said she'd happily open up the terminal for me to go into this bus locker. The key was in his property. And the only thing that she asked was that I pick her up, that I take her down there, and that I return her back to her home when I've completed my investigation there. So we went to the terminal. I opened up the locker in her presence. I found a bag, and I didn't find any identification, but I found a stamped, addressed envelope to someone in Quincy, and I believe it was a housing project. It could have been an apartment building, but I think that the Quincy cops told me later it was a housing project. The return address just said a friend in California. And being the curious guy I am and having obtained consent to do a search, I read the letter that was within this envelope. And I'm not going to quote it verbatim, but pretty much it said, "Dear Dad, I'm sorry for upsetting you and the other family members. I've been accused of something I didn't do. When all this is settled, I'll be home. Until then, know that I'm okay, and I'll be out here on the West Coast. I can't give you an address. You understand why. Love," and then a scribble that I couldn't read.
Hmm.
But it had an address on it. So I contacted Quincy PD. I told them what I had. I gave them the information that he provided me as to his identity, and they said they couldn't find anything that matched it. And per my request, the PD sent a couple officers out to that apartment building or housing project to try and contact the occupant of the alleged father. And they knocked at the door, rang the intercom, nobody answered. So now we've had about 2 hours pass, almost 3. I get called into the watch commander's office, and the lieutenant at the time said, "Look, if all you have on this guy is a traffic violation, you're going to have to give him a citation and let him go now because he's complaining to have medical issues. And I don't want you to be stuck babysitting him at the hospital
Yeah.
for a jaywalking violation. So I'm using my command authority to tell you to let him go, drive him to the hospital, give him a citation, and put him at the front door."
And in California, do you have to get him bailed by a bail commissioner, or can you guys just release him yourselves?
Well, here's the thing. Even though I could make the arrest, I also still had authority to release him on a written promise to appear. And
Okay.
if he was booked, there's set bail for infractions and misdemeanors and actually even felonies at the time. And even though some of those bail conditions may have changed, most recently because of the COVID issues, back then I want to say the bail was $25 or $50. And he didn't have it, but the watch commander in his infinite wisdom decided that it just wasn't worth it for me to babysit this guy at the hospital while
Sure.
we waited for a doctor to approve his booking and to just issue him a citation and let him go.
I totally get it. Just in Massachusetts, where I work, you put the bracelets on someone, it's over. You can't. It's called an unarrest if you let them go. And the first thing you tell you in police academy is never unarrest anybody. So it's like,
Oh gosh.
once
Yeah.
you arrest somebody, there's no like promise to appear. A bail commissioner actually has to come to the police department and get them to promise to appear, and then for $40, and then they leave. So that's just
In
a
California, you have the authority to release people under a variety of conditions.
That's
Either
awesome.
arrested for simple intoxication, or you believe upon further investigation that they haven't committed a crime.
Well, that only
or,
makes
quote, the
sense.
interest of justice.
That's like
Yeah.
that would be very useful here.
Yeah,
Put it that way.
surprised, but every state is different. I mean, we've all
Yeah.
got our own rules to go by, and although there's a lot of similarity between states, it doesn't mean that every detail matches.
Right.
So I argued my point as best I could, but the lieutenant was adamant. I drove him to the hospital. I wrote a citation with the information that he'd provided, and he signed it.
You're like, if
Walked into
this
the
is even
hospital.
you, here you go.
Yeah. And on the back of that citation, and I imagine this is going to be the same maybe in Massachusetts, we have a officer's copy of the citation that we can write notes on.
Yes.
And I wrote a note from the top of that pink copy to the bottom in the smallest writing I could, and I included every detail that I could about not just what he was arrested for and then cited for, but the name of the woman that opened up the uh, uh, Greyhound bus terminal, the information about the officers from Quincy that went to the address. I quoted portions of the letter. Thinking about it now, I wish I'd seized the letter as evidence. I didn't. But I took extensive notes. I wrote them on the back of this pink copy. And that was retained by the police department. And I was glad it did, because about a year later, may have been a little more, a little less, um, I was sitting in roll call, and my supervisor approached me with some papers, and he said, here, take a look at this stuff. The chief says, don't worry about it. You're not in any trouble. And what he gave me was a copy of a letter written to the chief of police in Santa Monica saying, Dear Chief, please help save my life. Several months ago or a year ago, and we had the date, one of your officers stopped me for jaywalking. And I didn't tell him the truth about my name. And subsequently, I was arrested for a crime I didn't do.
Whoa.
Please help save me, and ask the officer what he did with the photographs that were in the bus locker that showed I was at one place when the people of the state of Massachusetts are accusing me of having been somewhere else and committed a terrible crime.
What a tangled web we weave.
Yeah, it was very interesting.
Wow.
And he was kind enough to include in this letter not just the name and phone number and address of his attorney, but the name, phone number, and mailing address of the prosecutor, which proved very helpful.
Yeah.
Because I contacted the prosecutor, who told me that several weeks before my contact with this subject, he'd been the focus of an investigation regarding an attempted kidnapping of one child and the kidnapping and molestation of another child.
Whoa.
That his vehicle had been described in one case, and the vehicle and a license plate or partial license plate number had been described in the second incident. And that when the police came to talk to him about that second incident, they learned that coincidentally, just about the time that the crime had occurred, or right after the crime had occurred, that car had been taken to a salvage yard, crushed, and disposed of. This is before DNA evidence, but obviously there was a lot there that indicates a consciousness of guilt. But during his interview by the investigators, he denied being involved in the crime, denied being anywhere near the scene, denied any kind of involvement in criminal behavior at all. And I believe he had a clean record at the time this occurred. And rather than make an arrest, and again, I don't know what the laws of arrest are in Massachusetts, but rather than make an arrest, the investigators had gone to talk to a prosecutor, perhaps to obtain a warrant, rather than make an arrest based on probable cause. And in that time period, he left the state. He went west, was later determined to have taken up residence in West Hollywood, and was living in West Hollywood, but they didn't know where until he made a couple phone calls to family members and I think a girlfriend in the Massachusetts area where he'd been living and where these crimes had occurred. And after one of these phone calls, they were able to trace the location of the call to a payphone, and subsequent assistance by, I think it was the U.S. Marshal Service and either Beverly Hills PD or West Hollywood Sheriffs, they were able to nab him when he was making another call from that same payphone.
Wow.
But the interesting thing is when he was arrested, he said that he had no idea he was wanted. He just moved out to the West Coast because he thought he had better opportunities for business there. So after explaining my contact with him and sending the prosecutor copies of the citation that I'd written, and the flip side of the officer's um, copy of the citation with all my notes. There wasn't any indicators showing a consciousness of guilt other than the flight itself. But I had the statements to me, I had the misinformation that he'd provided to me, and I had the information that I'd read in the letter to it turned out to be his father.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that, I kind of won the lottery, um, in that she wanted to subpoena me and fly me out to testify in Massachusetts at this guy's trial. I say kind of won the lottery because at the last minute, he took a 50-plus year plea rather than take the case to trial, and they canceled my court appearance. But again,
You
I mean,
almost
this
made
is
it out to
just
Beantown.
almost. It would have been my first time on the East Coast. But again, what it shows is the importance of not just using the right type of techniques in terms of getting information from someone to show whether or not they're being credible, whether or not there's signs of a consciousness of guilt, but how important corroboration is to
Yeah,
show whether or not those admissions are credible.
absolutely. Well, that's incredible. Gary, I have a few more questions for you. Do you have time?
I've got all the time in the world. It's still early in the afternoon here.
All
If
right.
I'm not keeping you up, I'm not keeping you away
No,
from work. I got no problem.
not at all. I love it. I'm going to put us on a quick break and then get right back. Okay.
Certainly.
Gary, we're back.
I'm back.
Hey,
Great.
you mentioned earlier something that was very, very interesting to me. This idea, not idea, but this thing of fake confessions. I just wanted to have you explain and talk about some experiences you had with that. I know there's one incident that you had with a friend and coworker that had to do with a fake confession. Could you talk about that?
Well, let me point out a couple things. First off, for many years now, there has been an issue that's been looked at by the press and the public at large regarding false or unreliable confession evidence. And there's extremes on both sides. One, you got cops, and I've heard experienced LAPD detectives say that you cannot get someone to confess to a crime they didn't commit. And I've heard people on the other side saying there's probably hundreds of thousands of false confessions out there, that the cops are always getting false confessions from people, and that cases like the Brian Banks case in Long Beach are extremely common. And as usual, the truth lays somewhere in the middle.
Right.
You can, of course, you can get someone to confess to something they didn't do. And I've testified to this in court dozens of times.
I'm sure if they get
Absolutely
if
true.
they get enough incentive to plead guilty, then they will.
Absolutely. And by the same token, even people that are involved in the Innocent Project will admit that while unreliable confession evidence has been involved in roughly 20% of reversals that the Innocence Project has dealt with, much of this confession evidence includes cases where the subject wasn't even questioned by the police. He or she may have invoked the right to remain silent, but they took a plea bargain. And that was the case with the Brian Banks incident, where he was arrested for the sexual assault of a young woman in Long Beach and was given an offer of, I think it was 8 years in state prison, rather than looking at far more time, even though he said that he hadn't sexually assaulted this woman. I think he told the police that there had been a consensual physical relationship between the two at the location, but it wasn't an assault. And he took the plea deal. And then years later, after he got out of jail, this girl contacted him on Facebook, said she wanted to get together with him and talk. And he got her to admit on electronic recording that he had never assaulted her, that it was a consensual encounter between the two, and that she had felt compelled to make this allegations against him. The police didn't force him to say that he'd sexually assaulted her. He took the plea even after talking with his attorney, and his attorney said, according to him, that his chances didn't look good if he took the case to trial, and upon conviction he'd be looking at much more time than if he took the state's offer.
Oh, awful.
So it is, but again, the truth is in the middle somewhere. And in California, even though these investigators, and I don't know the investigators involved, I don't know the techniques they used to interview either the alleged victim, who turned out to have been lying, or to Mr. Banks. In California, they would have been committing a crime if they had asked the alleged victim if she'd be willing to take a polygraph exam. And while polygraph tests may or may not be reliable, and I understand there's about a 10% failure rate amongst those who've done studies of the effectiveness on polygraphs. Right. The use of the polygraph as an investigative tool is valuable. Yeah. And I know from past experience that asking someone whether they'd be willing to take a polygraph exam, that in and of itself has resulted in some real eye-opening revelations.
Sure.
And yet the officers that were investigating this alleged sexual assault couldn't even broach that subject with the victim. They could with the alleged offender, but they couldn't with the person making the accusation, and that hamstrung them.
Yeah.
So again, if you're using best practices, what you're trying to do is to determine what the truth is. And unless you're right there and you videotape it, you audio record it, and you get people to sign statements, we won't know for sure what occurred. What one person saying is true, what saying is most and establish a level of credibility that you can't just do by winging it. And that's why I push best practices. I've been offered opportunities to train people in behavioral analysis based interview and interrogation techniques. I've done this. I did it when I was a police officer in Santa Monica with my peers. I've trained people at Citizens Academy programs on interview and interrogation. I've trained law students, and I've trained literally hundreds of lawyers on interview and interrogation best practices. It's a very important tool to use, but like any complex tools, it has to be learned by people that are using a formal program, and then it has to be practiced. And if you're going to use the techniques that I've found so effective, you need that formal training. And although I can touch on some of those techniques and why they're so important, I think it's very important to know that practice and developing the skills is hugely an issue when it comes to your ability to get admissions that are credible. You can't just go into a room, after taking a 1 hour class or listening to a 1 hour or 2 hour podcast and saying, well, I know how to do this now.
Except this podcast. After this, they will be experts.
Except this one, maybe. Yeah.
Right. Gary, what was I going to ask you? Here it is. You're now an expert in the field. You're not a police officer anymore. And some might say you're working for the dark side. You're working for defense now. You're given tasks. You might be hired to work against the police. You might be asked to put your eye on a situation that involves police officers where you unravel their investigation. So, which I think is incredibly interesting. And I've known people in the past, like we talked about before the interview, before we started, where I've known police officers that have done PI stuff and have done this exact thing, where I don't see the issue, because you're ultimately, like you've said repeatedly, what we want is the truth. What we want is justice. So it's not really, in my eyes, you're working against the police. I think everybody's working for justice, for the truth is what you want. But I also am a police officer, and I know how police operate and think. Do you feel that at all? How does it feel working for the defense? And have you had any? Has there been any repercussions, or what's your experience?
I got my PI license right after I retired in 2008, and was appointed by the courts within a year as a investigative resource for indigent criminal defendants that weren't covered by the public defender's office. So
indigent criminal offenders. What does that mean?
Defendants. Yeah.
Okay.
I call them offenders because they're just defendants right then. But
okay, gotcha.
Well, what happens in California, and I'm sure most other states have similar situations, is you have a public defender's office that if you are arrested for some kind of criminal violation, you do have the right under the Constitution for proper defense, for a defense attorney, investigative support, and if necessary, expert witnesses. And if you don't have the money, then the state or the county picks up the bill. Now, in many jurisdictions, Los Angeles County included, they have a public defender's office, which by law has to have the same amount of money and resources allocated to it as the prosecutor's office. That said, if you have multiple defendants on a case, say you have 3 defendants on a case, they can't all be represented by the same attorney, right? Or the same law firm. So if suspect A is represented by the public defender's office and has a deputy public defender and has a investigator that works for the public defender's office, and maybe there's some witnesses, expert witnesses they want to use, what about suspect or defendants B and C? They're not going to be represented by that same person or even the same office, because if
Right.
he decides he wants to testify against the others, it's not in the interest of A to have his attorney counseling B and C. So in California, you have the alternate public defender's office, which is basically private attorneys that are appointed by the courts working for an organization that serves the same purpose as the public defender's office. And then you have the Indigent Criminal Defense Panel, which is a list of approved attorneys, defense attorneys, that a judge can pick from and assign attorneys to represent suspect or defendant C or D or E or F. But
Sure.
they're all working separately so that the person they're representing can have faith that their attorney is working for them. He's not, or she is not, working for the co-defendants, and will only have that defendant's best interests at heart.
Right. Can I just interject and say,
Sure.
this is part of the greatness of the American justice system.
Absolutely.
This is people getting their fair shake in court. I mean, this is good. My wife and I are just rewatching the John Adams series. It's so good on HBO. It's so good.
Excellent.
And Paul Giamatti does such a good job. And his first major case that got him any notoriety, he defends the British soldiers that shoot a bunch of unarmed colonists that were throwing rocks and threatening and whatever. But it's just, he's so full of righteousness and justice that it's beautiful. That's the spirit of America being born in that series. And, cops can get their hair across their ass about it, but really, this is good. Like, this is great. There's people that are taking up the mantle of the defendant, of these people that can't afford justice. Because otherwise, what do we have? We have kangaroo courts, So I just wanted to say that. I just think it's good, ultimately.
Absolutely. And I think that the vast majority of cops would agree with you, and the small minority that simply don't have the exposure to the justice system that you and I have had. Because I'll tell you something, it's really good, let's put it this way, it's very easy to say that suspects are the bad guys. They damn well should go to jail. They ought to, rot in prison. They ought to be punished thoroughly until that offender or alleged offender turns out to be a cop or someone that you personally know.
Exactly.
And then things aren't the same.
Right.
And in my case, personally, and I am not going to yet get to the issue regarding my friend that was working with me and was an LOD death. But even outside of that, when I was quite young in my law enforcement career, there was a young woman that I knew that found herself accused of murder for defending her own life after being the victim of domestic violence. And I knew this person years prior to this incident. I knew what she was like in terms of not being a violent person, and that I just couldn't picture her being involved in a situation where she'd willingly shoot someone and ultimately kill someone unless it was absolutely without any question necessary. And I sat in on the trial, a lot of the trial, not all of it, but on my days off, I attended the trial several times. And honestly, um, when the jury came back 10-2 for acquittal, and the judge ended up deciding to dismiss the case with prejudice, I absolutely understood it. I got it. I don't think she should have been charged. That said, the whole purpose of the investigation, the whole purpose of the prosecution, the preliminary hearing, and ultimately the trial and the decision by the jury mattered. And if you're not going to have faith in our legal system, what the hell are you doing being a cop?
Yeah.
I mean, that's the fundamental. And
Yeah.
I'll tell you, I've had a couple people truly express anger, if not confusion, as to why I became a defense resource. But I'll tell them the same thing that I'm saying right now to you, and that is that if you believe in the system uh, and you believe that you have something to offer in terms of your expertise and abilities for the trier of fact, then you're not going to have a problem doing this sort of work. I didn't have a problem supplying information that uh, was exculpatory when I was a detective. It's something we have to do, just like we provide the information that's incriminating to defense counsel.
Sure.
And we're not going to run around and try to hide things that are exculpatory because we think that our case is solid. You do that, which in fact is violating the law. You do that if you think you don't have a case and you're acting out of personal animus.
Mm.
And I've known a lot of cops that have retired and gone on to be investigative or even expert resources in criminal cases, because bottom line is nobody's paying you enough to get on the stand and lie to anybody. I didn't
Right.
perjure myself as a cop, and I wouldn't perjure myself as an investigator working for the defense or as an expert working for the defense. I'm an investigator and or an expert, and those things don't change. Now, I will tell you that there are other rules. As an investigator, you're bound by the same attorney-client privilege laws that a lawyer is, and there's good reasons for that. It doesn't mean you have to like them, but just like a lot of things in our system of justice, it's a balance between the rights of the individual and the rights of society.
Sure.
And if things get out of balance, then you have either anarchy or tyranny. And that's why I, like you, respect the Constitution. But there will never be anyone to pay me enough to either get on the stand and lie under oath, or to suggest and to suborn others to commit the act of perjury.
Right.
And it'll be 13 years that I've been retired this June. And you figure 12 years of that I've been a resource. And in those 12 years, I have never had an incident where a lawyer that I was working with tried to get me to commit perjury. And I've only had one case, and this is out of 300, 400 plus cases that I've worked as an investigator, as an expert. And I've only had one case where an attorney vehemently disagreed with my assessment on a confession case, and that was when I said that a cop telling a suspect that was being questioned he understood where they were coming from was a reasonable response, even though he may not have meant it, and that it wasn't any form of coercion. He wanted me to say it was coercive, and I just flat wouldn't do it. Now, regarding my confession cases, I've had well over 100 cases. I don't know, 120, 130 cases I've worked as a confessions expert.
Wow.
Roughly a third of those cases are situations where the defense attorney has a matter that concerns admissions that are made by a client, and he or she thinks that uh, maybe the admissions were coerced or should be inadmissible, or that they're unreliable, but they don't know because they're not an expert.
Right.
So they get me appointed by the courts to take a look at the case, and in that third of the cases, I look at all the material, including the police reports, and I say, um, there's some things here that I might have done differently if I was the investigator, but it all meets the standard of best practices. There's always going to be some things someone will do differently than me, but it doesn't mean it's wrong. It just means it's a little different.
Mm.
And there's a third of the cases that I've had that I see some serious issues. And it may not be serious enough to get the case um, either overturned on an appeal, or serious enough that with the other evidence, the trier of fact is going to come back with a not guilty verdict. But defense attorneys have a job, and that job is to offer the best possible defense.
Sure.
And if they don't do that, then right there, the case is reversible on appeal due to ineffective counsel. And to protect themselves as well as their client, a good attorney, an ethical attorney, will get an expert appointed to examine the matter and to, if nothing else, make some suggestions of avenues that that attorney might take to demonstrate that they're performing best practices by asking the right questions on cross-examination, by bringing up issues that the jury should think about. So that constitutes about a third of the cases that I've been appointed to. And then the last third is the serious ones, the significant problems where I see a very strong probability that we've got a case involving a confession that's unreliable, if not false.
How does it?
Those I find interesting.
How does it work legally when, say, you're hired by defense counsel and you start looking into it and you're going against what they want? Are they obligated to bring that to court now?
No. They aren't obligated to do that any more than they're obligated to make the people's case for them. If the defendant tells them that
so they'll just fire you.
Alibi, and they just I get paid for the time I put in, and I'm restricted by attorney-client privileges in terms of what I can talk about, either publicly or to the court or to the prosecution, and I respect that part of the system. But that said, the process has to be protected, and while the people have a responsibility to the truth of the matter, and that means to exonerating defendants that are wrongly accused, the defense attorneys, their responsibility is to the clients as an individual. So if the defense attorney hears from a defendant that the defendant claims to have been in a store 50 miles away when the crime occurred, and the defense attorney has investigative support that goes to the store, that talks to witnesses, and learns that the defendant's claims aren't true, and the defendant even admits that he or she lied about the alibi, the defense attorney is under no obligation to bring that to the attention of the prosecutor. In fact, if they were to do it, they would be committing civil as well as possibly a criminal wrong. They'd certainly be disbarred. Their job is not to suborn perjury, but they also don't have a responsibility. In fact, they have a responsibility to not disclose information that comes up in the course of attorney-client privileged discussions and
Sure.
investigations.
Do you get any? Have you had any cases that are not so heavy, just like an OUI or something like that? That's kind of simple.
The vast that I've been appointed to are felony cases, and most of those, because of my background as an investigator, have involved pretty serious crimes of violence. Probably the majority are homicides, and then I've had quite a few sexual assaults and uh, robbery cases, but mostly homicides and attempted homicides.
Okay. So you said you had an incident with a friend, coworker involving a false confession. What was that?
Well, I think I stated earlier that a lot of what I do in terms of training is to inform defense attorneys, and I've done this in front of as many as 600 defense attorneys
Oh
at
my
one time,
goodness, Gary.
um, doing presentations regarding confession evidence.
Sure.
And I know most cops, myself included to some degree, used to think that all these defense attorneys, I think the word I use is low life, pond scum or scum suckers or something.
Yeah.
But most of them that I've actually dealt with are pretty good. Yeah, good people. They're ethical people. When it came to issues regarding ethics, I can honestly say I've had probably the same tiny minority of unethical defense attorneys I've dealt with as unethical prosecutors over the years that I've been working
Well,
percentage
yeah. I
wise.
mean, they're like you mentioned, they can be disbarred, so they
They
have to have
can't.
some kind of honor code.
Generally, yes, but I don't think that attorneys don't go through the training that we do. And uh, having been in an academic environment as a presenter, I think it's pretty clear that to me that a police officer's training is a lot more based on the reality on the street than what happens in a courtroom or in the appellate courts.
Sure.
It's real stuff, and it's one of the reasons why I wanted to be a cop instead of being an attorney, and I had the opportunity. But to go back to your original question, so I've trained hundreds of defense attorneys on interview and interrogation from a cop's perspective. And among the things that I've taught them was how we do it properly using best practices, why we're doing what we do, or what I did, um, in order to get credible information. And the question does come up in a lot of their minds. Are you just looking to win the game like we do? And when I say we, I'm talking about attorneys, because coming from a purely academic background, as most attorneys come from, winning is important to them.
Sure.
So it's moot court or whatever. If they're playing a golf game, it's all the same. You and I have seen blood on the street, and we hear victims' real stories. And I talk about how important it is to get credible information when it comes to doing interviews and interrogations. And one of the things I like to talk to them about after I tell them what we do to get credible information is what happens if you don't use these techniques, either because you didn't elect to use the training or you never got the training. And in December of 1980, there was a very good friend of mine that was a police officer for the city of San Fernando in California, and his name was Dennis Webb. And Dennis Webb was working patrol on Christmas Eve morning, December 24th, 1980, when he heard via scanner in the police car of an armed robbery that occurred just outside the city limits. of San Fernando, an armed robbery that happened at a 7-Eleven market. And it was a very basic description of a suspect, like male, white, or Hispanic, late teens, early 20s, dark colored clothing. And the area where this occurred was LAPD Foothill Division, which you're probably familiar with. And over a couple hours, Dennis didn't hear anything else on the radio. He left the city limits to take his lunch break. And while returning back to the city and within the city limits, he saw somebody walking down the street roughly 4:30 a.m. It was a young man, it was a white kid, dark clothes, obviously a very late night, early morning hour. And this person didn't run. They made eye contact. Dennis got on the radio and he asked the dispatcher if there was any further description of the suspect. And dispatch came back after calling LAPD and said that what information had been provided earlier was pretty much it. And the subject was seen walking a couple, 3 miles away from where the crime occurred. And Dennis decided that he was going to do a pedestrian stop and investigate whether or not this is the guy. Unfortunately, the suspect wasn't displaying the kind of behavior and he didn't have the looks of someone that you and I may have expected a robber to have or to do. He didn't run. He didn't appear to be a street person. He didn't match the quote profile of someone that commits most robberies. And Dennis asked for backup to respond, and as it was, the backup was less than a mile away. When they arrived, they found Dennis unconscious and bleeding to death, and his police car was gone. And the officers struggled to get Dennis into one of their police cars, and they ended up taking him back to the same emergency room where he'd had lunch, and he died on the operating room table.
Oh my goodness.
And as you know, as a police officer, when a brother or sister officer falls in the line of duty, it's a very traumatic thing to everyone in the organization. Well,
yeah,
San Fernando at the time had, I think it was less than 30 full-time officers working for the department. They had at least twice that many that volunteered time as reserves. They had some civilian employees, but it was a very, very difficult time for the agency. And they utilized the assistance of the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department Homicide Bureau to follow up on what clues came up over the next couple of months. And there wasn't a lot. The car was recovered several miles away, abandoned. Because of the hour when this happened, there wasn't any eyewitnesses to it. And within several weeks of Dennis's death, a phone call was received from a police department in, I want to say, Missouri, that had arrested a subject that was wanted for a couple murders that occurred in another state. I believe it was in Arizona. And this particular subject, there was good info on him regarding the Arizona murders, but while he was in custody, he had bragged to another inmate in the jail about having killed a police officer in Los Angeles about Christmas time. So they were really interested in talking to this guy. And the investigator from San Fernando PD at the time, who was a great cop and had gone on to a stellar career, including becoming the chief of police of a municipality in Los Angeles County outside of San Fernando, Beverly Hills, in fact.
Ooh,
he
big money.
Went to, yeah, and he's a hell of a good cop. And he also worked for the DA's office. His name's Don Rivetti. And Dom is an extremely thorough professional, um, very well trained at the time, but I don't believe that training included formal training in behavioral analysis based interview and interrogation. He went to Missouri with an investigator from LA County Sheriff's Department and a prosecutor from the DA's office to interview this person that was in custody. And the person made some statements um, admitting the responsibility of Dennis' death. And he also made statements contradicting the earlier statements. And when they pressed him for details in an attempt to corroborate his admissions of guilt, he had a great deal of difficulty doing that. He couldn't say what kind of gun was used, and then he'd change his mind about the caliber, the model from a revolver to a semi-automatic. He'd go back and forth on that and a number of other issues. But when you have the murder of a police officer and you have someone that's admitting to it, even though, as this guy was, you had someone with a history of mental illness, sometimes you're forced in a position where you've got to do something with it. In this case, the district attorney's office filed murder charges against this subject. So he was subsequently extradited to California, and I think he may have been held to answer a preliminary hearing. If not, that was coming up very shortly. But within about a month of his arrest, something else happened. And that something else was a young woman that was a student at a mining college in New Mexico overheard a fellow student talking to somebody in the cafeteria about how he'd done something really terrible when he'd gone home for Christmas to San Fernando or Selmar, where his family had lived.
Couldn't keep his mouth shut, huh?
Yeah, well, he blabbed, and it was a good thing that he did blab.
Yeah.
Because she overheard this, and her mother was a dispatcher for a law enforcement agency. And she said that she thought that whatever he'd done was very serious and could have been a murder, and that she in turn provided the information to the FBI, and the FBI was aware that a San Fernando police officer had been killed on New Year's Eve.
Sure.
They contacted LA County Sheriff's Department, and the deputy sheriff, in addition to Dom from San Fernando, went back to New Mexico, conducted some follow-up with the assistance from New Mexico authorities, and they recovered ballistics evidence because it turned out that the mining student had bought a handgun from somebody that was also in the campus community. And that handgun, with its distinctive rifling patterns within the barrel and the extractor markings and everything else, had left evidence at the scene of the shooting, empty casings and bullet fragments. And it just so happened that the person that had sold a pistol to the young man that was claiming to have done something in San Fernando still had empty cases from when he'd owned the gun and had reloaded ammunition that he'd included in the sale to the person that was believed to be the actual offender. So when they questioned this New Mexico suspect, and he subsequently admitted to having committed the shooting and described the gun that was used and said where he'd gotten it from, he wasn't just giving details that had been withheld from the public. He was providing information and evidence that corroborated those statements as being credible. Subsequent to that, the charges against the first suspect were dropped. William Mothershed, who was the shooter from New Mexico, ended up being convicted of the crime and was sentenced to life imprisonment.
Wow.
And I asked the attorneys, just like I would ask anyone, cops or just regular citizens, the listeners of your podcast, who here thinks that a police officer is going to want to arrest just anyone and not just the actual offender when it comes to the intentional murder, the cold-blooded murder of a cop in the line of duty. I
Right.
don't think you'll find anyone that believes that.
No.
Because again, I mean, your job as a police officer at all times is to seek out and to find the truth, to identify and enable the justice system to hold responsible the actual offender of a crime. And if you don't think that a cop is going to do everything they can to find the right person in a case involving law enforcement, here's a case where they had an unreliable confession, right? They had someone that was factually innocent that was charged with this crime. If you don't think that they would want to undo that mistake in order to get the actual offender, I don't think you're being realistic.
Right. Wow. That's crazy. And you say you were friends with this officer that died?
Before I went to Santa Monica PD, I was a reserve officer and a non-sworn employee with the City of San Fernando Police Department. And I rode patrol with Dennis Webb as a partner, and he was a personal friend of mine.
Wow.
And it affected me like it affected other people that worked and knew and was friends with Dennis. And it provided a hell of a learning moment for my career. When the shooting actually occurred, I had left San Fernando PD as a reserve to become a reserve in Santa Monica. And my full-time job was with the LA Community College District Police Department as a full-time police officer for Los Angeles Mission College.
Mm-hmm.
And the week before Dennis was killed, Dennis had made arrangements with my boss at the time to come work for us on a part-time basis because overtime opportunities in San Fernando were somewhat limited. But the college district would hire police officers from other agencies, including LAPD, to come work for us on a part-time basis. And Dennis had been approved to do that. And the morning of Dennis's death, my boss saw me after I'd arrived there, and she'd asked if I'd heard about Dennis. And I thought that she had some good news to tell me about Dennis's start date, because when I'd seen him last a couple days earlier, he talked about when he expected to be coming to work for us part-time.
Oh, man.
And we'd be working together again as partners. Yeah. And she told me that he'd been killed that morning, and it was a hell of a shock. But, you know, like other things that we've talked about before regarding my life, sometimes, you know, we have bad things that happen to us, and we can try and turn those horrible experiences into learning moments that can be useful, you know, for us personally as well as professionally.
Yes.
And I tried to do that with regards to Dennis's life and Dennis's death. And I use his death as a training moment for a number of reasons besides this, dealing with officer safety and field tactics in addition to the interview and interrogation aspect of it. There's a lot to learn from it. And I think that if we keep those things in mind, then we're a lot less likely to forget about somebody like Dennis that's given everything, literally everything, for us and for our safety.
Absolutely. Gary, your episode 54, when you first came on the podcast, I got responses for, you know, it's just for people getting into the job, and it's a battle. You know, it's, you know, you hear that they just, people want cops so bad. It's still very hard to become a cop. Like you still have the background process. You still have to make the cut in most cases. And your episode, when you talk about, it's very much an episode of perseverance. Like, you have great stories that are fun, but also just the personal side of it when you're battling an injury, you're working for a college, you're trying to get on with a city. I mean, at one point, if my memory serves me, you're going up against the chief himself to get hired. Like that stuff is, for a recruit, is terrifying. That's to imagine going up against the chief of police in Santa Monica, to fight for your job, and then have the head of the agency be like a little annoyed. It's a really great episode, and I got great feedback about it. And this episode has been so fun. You just have a lot of knowledge, Gary, and I'm just so thankful you came on and you're willing to share it. Just thank you. This was another great interview.
I appreciate the opportunity. I spent over 40 years involved in the criminal justice system, and you have a lot that happens to you, and it isn't about me. It's about the things that are happening, around all cops,
sure,
myself included. And I'm sure that there's, millions of active and retired police officers that could tell you about the same sort of things that I've experienced. I think I was very lucky to get on when and where I did. And the time that I spent as a police officer was a very busy time. I don't have any way of statistically proving it that I know of, but I'm guessing that as busy as the Roaring '20s was supposedly, in the earlier part of the last century.
Sure.
I think the 1970s and 80s were probably even more exciting, brutal, thought-provoking than the 1920s through 1930s. But it isn't necessarily a cool thing to talk about that in a lot of eyes, because you have this narrative that's trying to be pushed on the public that cops are heartless racists, and it's simply not true. It's simply not true. I mean, my first job in law enforcement, I told you about this before, in the mid 1970s, was as a student worker that I was working part-time, going to school full-time. My very first supervisor was a black sergeant who was the first African-American member of the San Fernando Police Department. And when I went into the academy, I had African-Americans, not just as partners, but on the staff with LASD. Throughout my career, I had them as supervisors, and I worked for a chief that was African-American. And to say that people like myself that had all these instances of training and one-on-one interactions, with people as partners, as supervisors, as managers, that were all coming from a racist, isolated, white supremacist background. It's just absurd. It's absolutely
so ridiculous.
Absurd. And it's insulting to the people that were my trainers and were my supervisors and were the people that ran the department that I worked for. It was ridiculous. The LA Community College District, the director of the LA Community College District Police Department was an African American. And his son, who also worked for the department and was one of my very first trainers, was African American. It's just
people
defies belief that
people don't get it. These major cities are. This isn't the 40s. The cops policing these communities look like their communities. These major cities go out of their way to make the police officers look like the community that they're policing. LAPD is a majority Hispanic, and then white, and then black, and then Asian. The reason for that is they're trying to look like their community. Baltimore PD is predominantly black because they're want to look like their community. People don't care to look at these things. They don't care to know facts. You know, Gary, I don't have to tell you. You know, the propaganda pushed out by the media against police is strong, and it's very hard to combat. But these police departments are really trying hard.
Well, but look at where these problems have occurred, and who was running those cities when these nationwide incidents happened. They're being run by the very same people that are accusing the agencies of malfeasance and the individuals and this system as being racist.
Yeah,
They're being run by the accusers.
I know.
And I'd like to look, if nothing else, let me give you one other very brief situation that might improve your morale or outlook on all this stuff.
Please.
Okay.
Please.
So for roughly 12 years, I've been a defense resource. I've been an investigator for those charged in serious criminal violations and an expert witness. Okay. And I've had somewhere between 300 and 400 cases I've been appointed to. Some of these cases involved working for defendants that were representing themselves pro per. Most of them were involving cases where they had legal representation that was appointed for them. In every single one of those cases, every single one, the defendant was made aware of my background as a former police officer. Every single case. In most of the cases, I'm not going to say most of the confession cases, because in those cases, it's more the exception than the norm that I actually sit down with and meet the accused myself. Well, most of what I do is to review materials, reports, and electronic recordings of what happens in an interrogation room. But in virtually every case that I've ever worked, the defendant was made aware of the fact that I'm a retired cop doing this as a side thing. After I've gotten a full retirement, which you're familiar with California retirement system, it's a very generous system. I don't need to do this financially. I do it because I believe in it. How many of those roughly 400 cases do you think that I had a client complain about me being a former cop and want me off the case? What percentage would you say out of 400 cases that I have where I was told, or the attorney was told, they wanted me off?
I'm gonna go on a limb and say 0.
Right. You're right. So if these people really didn't trust the police, and when I say these people, I'm talking about the accused, and most of the accused have had prior arrests and certainly prior convictions. I did not have one case where a defendant told their attorney or told their judge, I don't want him. I did have one case involving a pro per, and the pro per wanted me to do some things that I didn't believe were ethical. And I asked to get off the case, and the pro per argued against it after threatening to have me removed at their request.
Good for you.
And I just said, well, if you're worried about that, then just get another investigator. I don't need to do this, and I requested off.
Sure.
But that person wanted the judge to overrule my request to get off, and that's the closest I've come in any of these cases to having been removed because someone didn't feel comfortable with my acting in the role that I acted. So I ask you this because these people didn't know me. They hadn't had any prior contact with me. Now, some of the attorneys I'd worked with had represented people that I had investigated as a police officer. And I appreciate the confidence that those attorneys had and wanted to get me appointed.
Sure.
But none of those defendants, none of them wanted me off, and they didn't know me. And if they wanted me to stay on and they didn't know me, and I'm assuming that my situation wasn't unique, and I know for a fact that quite a number of investigators that I'd worked with in law enforcement, upon their retirement, did the same thing I did and became defense resources as investigators or even experts. And I've never heard of one of them being the subject of a removal request because of their prior work. What's it say to you about the narrative that the system is racist and biased against them, and cops shouldn't be trusted or believed?
Yeah.
What's that say?
It's a great point, Gary. That really is a great point. That's awesome. Gary, thank you so much for coming on, man. This was a lot of fun, as always. So informative. I appreciate your time.
It was my pleasure, Steve. I hope we can do it again someday. I'm always available for you.
Absolutely, brother. I know you got another one in you. I can tell you got a lot of experience, and I'm not afraid to ask. I will keep bringing you on. So we
talk again when you have some time.
Absolutely. Let me do the outro, and then hang on the line, okay?
Sure.
Guys, thank you for joining us. This was episode 74 with the great Gary Steiner. Such a good time. Man, every time I talk to the guy, I learn something. It's just fun. I'm so glad he came on. Thank you for all the recent ratings and reviews. I'm like beating a dead horse here, but if you don't mind, if you've been consuming content for free for all this time, if you could just go to iTunes and leave a 5-star review, that is helpful. I appreciate it. Thank you very much for doing that. If you want to be a guest, it's thingspolicec.com. Scroll down, click be a guest. I'm always looking to bolster the roster for guests that come on. If you want merch, as I say, for the show, I think wrong side. The logo I think is really cool. I have a mug with it and I have a t-shirt with it. If anything else, it's cool. It's kind of 80s, art. It's pretty cool. Earlier, before Gary came on, I killed a spider right there on the wall. I am broadcasting from the basement, folks. This is low tech. I had to kill a spider because it's getting humid here and they're starting to come out. So I really appreciate the monthly donors. Really, really great. You guys are paying for Adobe. You're paying for any music I use. You're paying for the hosting fees. Monthly subscribers, thank you so much. I truly, truly appreciate it. It's thingspolicec.com. You can become a monthly subscriber there, or you can just give a one-off subscription, or not subscription, just donation to the podcast. I really love doing it. So if I just break even for this whole thing, that's fine. That's cool with me, because I believe that much in having these guys and gals on and them telling you their stories. So thank you for listening. Thank you for joining us, and I'll see you guys next time.